Susan sat in the dimly lit cell, her once powerful body now reduced to a frail shadow of what it had been. The cold metal bars around her formed a cruel reminder of her captivity, and the damp air carried the stench of rust and decay. She had lost count of how long she had been trapped here, days, weeks, months. Time had become meaningless in this forsaken place. Her captors had stripped her of everything, her weapons, her armor, even her dignity. She had once been a warrior, feared and respected across the stars. The mere mention of her name had sent enemies into retreat. But now she was nothing more than a prisoner, a spectacle for her captors to taunt and humiliate. They laughed at her suffering, tossing scraps of food into her cell as if she were a caged animal. Each day they would come to jeer at her, to remind her of the futility of resistance. "You're not so tough now, are you?" One of the guards sneered through the bars. He was a towering brute, his scaled skin glistening under the dim light. "The mighty warrior Susan, reduced to a weak, helpless creature. Maybe we should sell you off to the highest bidder. I hear some of our buyers have a taste for fallen warriors." Susan glared at him, but she lacked the strength to do more than that. Once she would have torn him apart with her bare hands, but starvation and exhaustion had drained her. She refused to beg. She refused to show weakness, even as her body trembled from hunger. She leaned back against the cold stone wall, her mind drifting to memories of her past life. The battles she had fought, the victories she had claimed, had all of it been for nothing? How had it come to this? Betrayal. That was the answer. The ones she had trusted had turned against her, selling her out to the very enemies she had sworn to defeat. She had been ambushed, captured, and thrown into this hellhole, waiting for a fate worse than death. At first, she had held on to the hope that someone would come for her, that her people, her allies, would mount a rescue. But as time passed, that hope withered away, replaced by a dull acceptance of her fate. No one was coming. She would die in this cage, forgotten by the universe. A shiver ran down her spine as she pulled her tattered cloak tighter around her body. The cell offered no warmth, no comfort. Sleep was a luxury she could no longer afford, not with the guards always watching, always waiting for a moment of weakness. They wanted to see her break. They wanted to strip away the last remnants of her pride. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Yet, deep down, a small part of her, the part that still clung to survival, whispered that escape was impossible. She had tried before, only to be met with brutal punishment. The walls were too high, the guards too numerous, the restraints too strong. Even if she did manage to break free, where would she go? This planet was nothing but a wasteland, a prison designed to hold those who would never see freedom again. Her hands clenched into fists as frustration burned inside her. She hated this feeling of helplessness. It was foreign, unnatural. She had spent her entire life fighting, defying the odds, refusing to submit. But here, in this cage, she was powerless. Footsteps echoed down the corridor and she tensed instinctively. Another tormentor? Another mockery of her situation? She forced herself to remain still, to show nothing. The door to the holding area creaked open and a different set of footsteps entered, lighter, more measured. Susan didn't bother to look up. It didn't matter who it was. It never did. Then a voice spoke, low and unfamiliar. Is this the one? There was something different about that voice. It lacked the usual cruelty, the arrogance of her captors. There was an edge of curiosity, perhaps even concern. For the first time in what felt like forever, Susan felt a flicker of something she had thought long dead. Hope. The facility was a fortress of steel and stone, deep in the heart of enemy territory. Mark moved like a shadow, his every step calculated, his breathing steady despite the tension thrumming through his body. The mission was clear. Retrieve stolen intelligence and extract without being detected. A simple infiltration. Or so it was supposed to be. He crouched behind a stack of rusted crates, scanning the dimly lit corridor ahead. The air was thick, with the scent of oil and burnt circuitry, and the low hum of machinery vibrated beneath his boots. A pair of alien guards patrolled the hallway, their reptilian eyes darting around for any sign of intruders. Mark watched them for a moment, analyzing their movements, their timing. When they turned the corner, he slipped forward, pressing himself against the cold metal wall. The map in his wrist-mounted display showed the central data vault just a few levels above. That was his target. But something about this place felt off. There were rumors, whispers in the underground networks, that this facility wasn't just a military outpost. Some claimed it was a holding site for prisoners of war, but no one had confirmed it. Mark had seen plenty of horrors in his time as a warrior, but the idea of captives being left to rot in a place like this didn't sit right with him. As he continued through the corridor, his ears picked up a faint sound. A voice. Weak, hoarse, but unmistakably alive. He froze, listening. Is this the one? Mark's pulse quickened. He edged closer to the source of the voice, careful to remain unseen. Peering around the corner, he saw a large cage, a cell, built into the wall. Inside, slumped against the cold stone, was a figure barely recognizable as a warrior. She was tall, even in her weakened state, her once formidable body now covered in tattered cloth and bruises. Long silver hair cascaded over her face, hiding her expression. But even through the filth and exhaustion, Mark could tell she was no ordinary prisoner. A guard stood outside the cell speaking to another alien, likely an officer. She's still alive, barely. Not sure why the boss keeps her here. We should have sold her off already. The officer chuckled darkly. No buyers willing to risk taking in a disgraced warrior like her. Her people won't come for her. And humans, he spat the word like venom. They wouldn't waste their time. Mark's jaw clenched. They were wrong. The officer smirked and tapped the bars with the butt of his weapon. Enjoy your last days, warrior. No one's coming for you. The two aliens turned and walked away, laughing as they disappeared down the corridor. Mark exhaled slowly. This wasn't his mission. He was here for the data. A clean in-and-out job. But something about the woman in that cage, the way she sat, there, alone, abandoned, made his gut twist. She had been left to die here, and yet, she hadn't broken. Without hesitation, he stepped toward the cell. Susan didn't react at first when she heard the quiet footsteps approach her cell. She had learned long ago that movement only encouraged her captors, that showing interest in anything only led to more pain, so she remained still, her breath slow, her body unmoving, waiting for the inevitable mockery, the cruel jabs, the reminder that she was nothing but a caged failure. But then, something unexpected happened. Instead of the usual taunts or the harsh rattle of her cage being struck with a weapon, a voice, deep, firm, yet unfamiliar, spoke. "You're Susan, right?" Her eyes snapped open, and for the first time in weeks she lifted her head. The voice wasn't one of her captors. It lacked their smug arrogance, their condescending tone. It was different. Blinking away the haze of exhaustion, she focused on the figure standing just beyond the bars. A man. No, not just any man. A human. Susan had fought humans before. They were resilient, stubborn creatures, but ultimately inferior to her kind in battle. Or at least that was what she had believed before. Seeing this one standing here in the heart of the enemy's stronghold changed that perception. He was tall, muscular, clad in dark combat gear, with a rifle slung across his back. His stance was confident, yet cautious, like a predator assessing whether or not it was safe to strike. And his eyes, sharp, calculating, yet filled with something she hadn't seen in so long. Determination. She scoffed weakly, shifting against the cold stone. "What do you want?" Her voice was hoarse from disuse, but it still carried a trace of defiance. The human knelt beside the bars, his gloved fingers brushing over the rusted metal. "I'm getting you out of here." Susan laughed, though it was more of a dry, bitter sound. "You? A human?" She gestured weakly at her restraints, the heavy shackles binding her wrists. You don't even know what they've done to me. He didn't flinch. I know enough. His gaze flickered to her bruises, to the scars along her arms, to the way she barely had the strength to sit up. I heard what those bastards said about you, that no one's coming. Her expression hardened. They're right. He exhaled through his nose, then reached into a pouch at his belt, pulling out a small device. Then it's a good thing I'm not no one. A tiny spark of confusion flickered in her tired mind. Why was he doing this? Why risk his life for a stranger, an alien no less? She had no allies left, no value to anyone. So what was his angle? She studied him as he worked, attaching the device to the cage's electronic lock. His hands were steady, precise, like a man who had done this before. There was no hesitation in his movements, no second guessing. The lock let out a soft beep, and suddenly the heavy door creaked open. Freedom. The realization hit her harder than she expected. The open doorway, the lack of restraints, it felt unreal, too easy. She didn't move. The human's brow furrowed. Can you stand? Susan swallowed, testing her limbs. Pain lanced through her, but she gritted her teeth and pushed herself up against the wall. She staggered, but before she could collapse, the human was suddenly at her side, his strong arms catching her. His warmth was startling. She had grown so used to the cold. Easy, he murmured. We need to move fast. She clenched her jaw, hating how weak she felt, how much she had to rely on him. But as she steadied herself, gripping his arm for balance, a strange feeling crept into her chest. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't alone. Susan didn't react at first when she heard the quiet footsteps approach her cell. She had learned long ago that movement only encouraged her captors, that showing interest in anything only led to more pain. So she remained, still, her breath slow, her body unmoving, waiting for the inevitable mockery, the cruel jabs, the reminder that she was nothing but a caged failure. But then, something unexpected happened. Instead of the usual taunts or the harsh rattle of her cage being struck with a weapon, a voice, deep, firm, yet unfamiliar, spoke. You're Susan, right? Her eyes snapped open, and for the first time in weeks she lifted her head. The voice wasn't one of her captors. It lacked their smug arrogance, their condescending tone. It was different. Blinking away the haze of exhaustion, she focused on the figure standing just beyond the bars. A man. No, not just any man. A human. Susan had fought humans before. They were resilient, stubborn creatures, but ultimately inferior to her kind in battle. Or at least that was what she had believed before. Seeing this one, standing here in the heart of the enemy's stronghold, changed that perception. He was tall, muscular, clad in dark combat gear, with a rifle slung across his back. His stance was confident, yet cautious, like a predator assessing whether or not it was safe to strike. And his eyes sharp, calculating, yet filled with something she hadn't seen in so long. Determination. She scoffed weakly, shifting against the cold stone. What do you want? Her voice was hoarse from disuse, but it still carried a trace of defiance. The human knelt beside the bars, his gloved fingers brushing over the rusted metal. I'm getting you out of here. Susan laughed, though it was more of a dry, bitter sound. You? A human? She gestured weakly at her restraints, the heavy shackles binding her wrists. You don't even know what they've done to me. He didn't flinch. I know enough. His gaze flickered to her bruises, to the scars along her arms, to the way she barely had the strength to sit up. I heard what those bastards said about you, that no one's coming. Her expression hardened. They're right. He exhaled, through his nose, then reached into a pouch at his belt, pulling out a small device. Then it's a good thing I'm not no one. A tiny spark of confusion flickered in her tired mind. Why was he doing this? Why risk his life for a stranger? An alien, no less. She had no allies left, no value to anyone. So what was his angle? She studied him as he worked, attaching the device to the cage's electronic lock. His hands were steady, precise, like a man who had done this before. There was no hesitation in his movements, no second guessing. The lock let out a soft beep, and suddenly, the heavy door creaked open. Freedom. The realization hit her harder than she expected. The open doorway, the lack of restraints, it felt unreal. Too easy. She didn't move. The human's brow furrowed. "Can you stand?" Susan swallowed, testing her limbs. Pain lanced through her, but she gritted her teeth and pushed herself up against the wall. She staggered, but before she could collapse, the human was suddenly at her side, his strong arms catching her. His warmth was startling. She had grown so used to the cold. "Easy," he murmured. "We need to move fast." She clenched her jaw, hating how weak she felt, how much she had to rely on him. But as she steadied herself, gripping his arm for balance, a strange feeling crept into her chest. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't alone. Mark tightened his grip on Susan's arm as she struggled to stand. He had expected her to be in bad shape, but seeing her like this, so thin, so weak, ignited a deep rage inside him. The stories of her past, the reputation she once had, none of it mattered right now. What mattered was getting her out of here alive. "Can you walk?" he asked, his voice lower now, more urgent. Susan exhaled sharply. "If I can't, will you carry me?" Mark smirked. "If I have to." She scoffed but said nothing, her pride barely holding on. She took an unsteady step forward and Mark moved with her, keeping his body close in case she collapsed again. The hallway outside her cell was dimly lit, the flickering lights casting long shadows along the rusted walls. The facility had a cold, lifeless feel to it, a place designed to break the spirits of those trapped inside. Mark guided Susan toward the end of the corridor, his ears sharp for any sound of approaching guards. "My extraction point is a quarter-mile from here," he whispered. "Once we're outside, I have a ship waiting." Susan shook her head. "You planned this?" "No, I came for something else. You were a bonus." She gave him a skeptical look, but he didn't elaborate. She didn't need to know that he had been operating under orders, that he had originally been sent for stolen intelligence. She didn't need to know that finding her here had changed everything. They moved as quickly as her condition allowed, but every step was a struggle. Susan's breathing was labored, and Mark could feel the weight of exhaustion in every movement she made. Suddenly he heard the sound of approaching footsteps. Voices. Mark cursed under his breath. He pushed Susan against the wall, flattening himself beside her. He reached for his weapon, but she grabbed his wrist. "Wait," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mark hesitated, watching as two guards passed by the hallway ahead, speaking in their guttural alien tongue. They didn't even glance in their direction. As soon as they disappeared, Mark exhaled and turned to her. "How did you know?" Susan gave him a weak smirk. "I've been here long enough to recognize their patrols." Mark studied her for a second. Even in her weakened state, she was still a warrior at heart. He nodded. "Then let's get the hell out of here." They continued down the hall, each step bringing them closer to freedom. The corridor seemed endless, every step an effort for Susan, but she refused to let herself falter. Mark led the way, his movements swift and precise, checking every corner before they advanced. His grip on his weapon was firm, his gaze sharp, and for the first time in a long while, Susan felt something close to safety. But they weren't free yet. As they neared the facility's exit, Mark stopped abruptly, raising a hand for Susan to halt. She obeyed, pressing herself against the wall, her breath shallow. He leaned forward, peering around the next turn before ducking back. His jaw tightened. "What is it?" Susan whispered. "Checkpoint," he murmured. 4 guards, armed. Susan closed her eyes briefly, suppressing a bitter laugh. Of course, it wouldn't be that easy. Mark's mind was already working, formulating a plan. He reached into a pouch at his belt, pulling out a small, disc-shaped device. "I have a flash charge," he said. It'll blind them for a few seconds, that's all we need. Susan arched a brow. You plan to take down 4 guards in a few seconds? I've done worse. He smirked slightly, but the confidence in his tone was real. Susan studied him for a moment. He wasn't just some reckless soldier. He knew what he was doing. She exhaled. Fine. Do it. Mark pressed a button on the device, then tossed it around the corner. A sharp whomp of compressed energy exploded, followed by startled shouts from the guards. Mark moved instantly. He darted around the corner, rifle up. The guards, still dazed, barely had time to react before he took down 2 of them with precise, silenced shots. Susan forced herself forward, ignoring the protest of her limbs. One of the remaining guards turned, his weapon raising toward Mark. Instinct took over. Susan lunged forward, grabbing the guard's arm and twisting it sharply. He cried out, but she was already moving, forcing him off balance. Using the last of her strength, she wrenched the weapon from his grip and slammed the butt of it into his temple. He crumpled. Mark dispatched the last guard, his movements efficient. Then, silence. Mark turned to Susan, surprise flickering in his expression. Not bad. She breathed heavily, gripping the stolen weapon. I may be half dead, but I'm not helpless. Mark chuckled. Noted. Now let's move. He led the way through the checkpoint, stepping over the unconscious guards. Beyond them was a reinforced door, the exit. Susan's heart pounded as Mark pressed another device to the door's control panel. Seconds passed. Then with a loud hiss, the massive door slid open. A gust of cold air hit Susan's face. The outside, the night sky. She had forgotten what fresh air smelled like. Mark grabbed her wrist, pulling her forward. Come on, we're not safe yet. They stepped outside, into a dark landscape, the rocky terrain stretching into the distance. A few hundred meters away, hidden among the jagged cliffs, Susan spotted it. A small, sleek ship. Their escape. But before they could take another step, alarms blared behind them. Susan turned. Lights flashed across the facility as the remaining guards realized their prisoners were escaping. Mark's expression hardened. We run, he said, now. And they did. Susan forced her aching legs to move as she sprinted across the uneven terrain, each step a battle against exhaustion. Mark ran beside her, his grip firm on her wrist, guiding her through the darkness. The ship was close, so close, but the alarms behind them had awakened the entire facility. The night exploded with red warning lights and distant shouts. A siren blared through the air, shrill and urgent. Susan stole a glance over her shoulder and saw guards pouring out of the entrance, their weapons gleaming under the artificial lights. Shots rang out. Mark yanked her to the side and they ducked, behind a jagged rock formation as laser rounds scorched the ground where they had just been standing. Susan's breathing was ragged, her limbs shaking from exertion, but she gritted her teeth. She had endured worse. She would endure this. Mark peeked around the rocks, his eyes scanning the landscape. His jaw tightened. We don't have time. For a firefight, we need to move fast. Susan exhaled sharply. Then let's move. Mark nodded, pulling a small device from his belt. He pressed a button, and the distant ship came to life, its engines humming as its lights flickered on. The cockpit's automated systems had detected his command. The guards behind them were closing in, their movements swift and organized. These weren't the same lazy, overconfident fools Susan had seen in the facility. These were trained killers. Mark raised his rifle and fired off a few shots, forcing the guards to slow their advance. Then he turned to Susan. Stay close, we're gonna have to make a break for it. She gave him a weak smirk, gripping her stolen weapon. Try to keep up. Without another word, they burst from cover and ran. The ship's ramp began to lower. As they neared, its metal surface gleaming under the moonlight. The engines roared louder, kicking up dust and loose rocks. Susan could taste freedom, feel it in her lungs. But the guards weren't letting them go that easily. More shots filled the air. A round grazed Susan's shoulder, and she stumbled, biting back a cry of pain. Mark reacted instantly. He swung an arm around her waist, hoisting her up and half carrying her toward the ship. She wanted to protest, to tell him she could still fight, but there was no time. He was moving with pure survival instinct, and she wasn't about to slow him down. They reached the base of the ramp just as another explosion of laser fire erupted behind them. Mark shoved Susan forward. "Get inside." She scrambled up the ramp, gripping the edges for support. As soon as she was in, she turned back. Mark was still at the bottom, covering their escape with precise, controlled bursts of fire. He took down 2 more guards before finally turning to run up the ramp himself. But then, a sniper's shot rang out. Susan's eyes widened as she saw the energy bolt tear through the air, heading straight for Mark. She didn't think. She moved. Throwing herself forward, she grabbed his arm and yanked him up just as the shot slammed into the metal where he had been standing. Mark stumbled into the ship, panting. He turned to her, shock flickering in his eyes. "You, shut up," she muttered, slamming her fist against the ramp controls. The metal door began to rise, sealing them inside. Mark wasted no time, rushing to the cockpit. Susan followed, her heart pounding. The ship trembled as enemy forces opened fire from the ground, but Mark's fingers flew across the controls, activating the thrusters. A deep, mechanical hum filled the cabin. Susan braced herself as the ship lurched, lifting, off the ground in a sudden, violent burst of power. The facility shrank beneath them, its guards growing smaller and smaller as the ship soared into the sky. They had done it. They had escaped. But as Susan slumped against the cold metal wall, her body finally giving into exhaustion, she realized something. She wasn't just running from captivity anymore. She was stepping into an unknown future, with a human by her side. The ship hummed around them, the vibrations of its engines a steady pulse beneath Susan's aching body. She sat on the cold metal floor of the cockpit, her back against the wall, her breath still ragged. Mark was at the controls, his hands steady as he piloted them through the upper atmosphere. The facility was nothing but a distant speck below them now, its alarms and gunfire fading into silence. They were free, or at least they should have been. Susan exhaled sharply, shifting her arm to inspect the wound on her shoulder. The graze wasn't deep, but the raw burn of it reminded her just how close she'd come to being left behind. Just how close Mark had come to not making it onto the ship. She glanced up at him, studying his profile as he worked. His jaw was set, in concentration, his eyes scanning the ship's displays with unwavering focus. "You okay?" he asked, not taking his eyes off the controls. Susan let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "I don't even know what okay means anymore." Mark glanced at her then, just for a second before looking back at the console. "You're alive. That's a good start." She shook her head. "Barely." Silence stretched between them, filled only by the beeping of the ship's systems. Finally, Susan asked the question that had been gnawing at her since he first arrived at the facility. "Why?" Mark frowned. "Why what?" She gestured weakly to him, to the ship, to the vast expanse of space they were now flying into. "Why did you come for me? You don't even know me. Why risk your life for a stranger?" Mark was quiet for a long moment. Then, without looking at her, he said, "Because someone had to." Susan narrowed her eyes. "That's not an answer." Mark exhaled through his nose, drumming his fingers against the control panel. "I had a mission," he admitted. "But it wasn't just about you. The people who captured you, they've taken others, humans, aliens, anyone they can use." His expression darkened. "I've seen what happens to the ones who don't make it out." Susan swallowed, memories of her own captivity flashing in her mind. "I wasn't going to let that happen to you," Mark continued, his voice quieter now. "Not if I could stop it." Susan watched him, trying to read past the careful control in his voice. He wasn't just saying this because he felt obligated. There was something deeper beneath his words. She looked down at her hands. "I thought I was going to die in that place." Mark's grip tightened on the controls. "Not on my watch." The ship's console suddenly beeped sharply. Mark frowned, his posture stiffening. Susan tensed. "What is it?" "Proximity alert," Mark muttered. He tapped a few buttons and the display screen lit up with red warning signals. A shape appeared on the radar, moving fast. Too fast. Susan's stomach twisted. "They're following us." Mark clenched his jaw. "Looks like they sent a fighter after us." The ship rocked slightly as the enemy vessel locked onto them. A warning light flashed on the console. Susan gritted her teeth. "Can we outrun them?" Mark's fingers flew over the controls. "Trying." The ship lurched forward, engines roaring as Mark pushed the thrusters to their limit. Stars blurred past the cockpit window, but the enemy vessel wasn't giving up. A sharp alarm blared. "They've locked onto us," Susan said, her hands gripping the seat. Mark cursed under his breath. "Hang on." The ship jerked to the side as he executed a sudden evasive maneuver. The enemy's first shot narrowly missed them, flashing past the hull in a streak of red energy. Susan's heart pounded. "We need a plan." Mark's eyes flicked to the weapon system. "We've got a couple of pulse cannons, but we're outgunned." Susan pushed herself to her feet, her body protesting every movement. "Then let's even the odds." Mark shot her a look. "You know how to use a ship's weapon system?" Susan smirked, despite the tension gripping her. "I know how to survive." Mark didn't argue. He flipped a switch, and a secondary control panel lit up in front of her. "Then show me what you've got." Another shot from the enemy fighter barely missed them, shaking the ship violently. Susan gripped the targeting controls, her mind focusing despite the pain in her body. She wasn't going back. She was not going to be a prisoner again. Taking a deep breath, she lined up the enemy fighter in her sights and fired. The pulse cannons erupted with a burst of blue energy, streaking through the darkness toward the enemy fighter. The first shot missed by a hair, skimming past its hull. The second shot forced the pilot to veer hard to the right, disrupting its pursuit. Susan's fingers were tight on the controls, her entire body thrumming with adrenaline. She didn't have time to think, only to act. The enemy ship was faster, sleeker, designed for combat. But she had something they didn't: desperation. Mark twisted the controls, sending their ship into a spiraling maneuver that barely evaded another incoming blast. "We need to take them out now," he shouted. "I can't keep dodging forever." Susan gritted her teeth, steadying her aim. The enemy ship was coming back around, trying to flank them. She took a deep breath, let instinct take over, and fired again. This time the shot struck. A direct hit to the enemy's left wing sent the fighter spiraling for a moment. Sparks erupted from the damaged section, and Susan felt a rush of victory. "They're not down yet," Mark warned, his eyes darting to the radar. The enemy was regaining control, adjusting for another attack. Susan adjusted her aim, ready to fire again. But before she could, another alarm blared through the cockpit. Mark's face paled. "They're calling for reinforcements." Susan's stomach twisted. "How long until they get here?" Mark's fingers flew across the console, scanning the data. His lips pressed into a thin line. Minutes, maybe less. That was it. The window was closing. If they didn't escape now, they never would. Susan exhaled sharply. "Then we need to make this quick." Mark nodded and pulled up a star map. "There's an asteroid belt not far from here. If we can make it, we might lose them in the debris." "Do it," Susan said without hesitation. Mark yanked the controls, and the ship lurched forward with a sudden burst of speed. The enemy fighter, despite its damage, was still tailing them, firing relentlessly. Shots streaked past, one grazing their hull. The ship rocked violently, sparks flying from the console. "We're taking damage," Mark shouted. Susan's heart pounded. "Keep going." The asteroid field was just ahead, a chaotic mess of tumbling rock and ice, illuminated by the distant glow of a dying sun. It was dangerous, but so was staying out here. Mark gritted his teeth and plunged the ship straight into the swirling mass of debris. The enemy fighter followed, its pilot determined not to lose them. Susan tightened her grip on the weapons controls, waiting for the right moment. The asteroids whirled around them, some the size of buildings, others small enough to be pulverized on impact. Mark twisted and turned the ship through the chaos, narrowly avoiding collisions at every turn. The enemy fighter wasn't as lucky. A massive chunk of rock spun straight into its path. The pilot barely had time to react before the asteroid clipped its wing, sending the ship into a death spiral. Susan took her chance. She locked onto the vulnerable fighter and fired one last time. The blast tore through the enemy's hull, and the ship erupted into flames, disappearing in a bright explosion that sent shockwaves rippling through the asteroid belt. Silence filled the cockpit. Susan exhaled, her body slumping with exhaustion. It's done. Mark let out a breath of his own, his grip on the controls finally easing. For now. The ship trembled slightly as it drifted deeper into the asteroid field, slowing to a safer speed. Susan leaned back, pressing a hand against her aching shoulder. The wound throbbed, but she barely noticed it anymore. Mark turned to her, studying her for a moment. "You all right?" Susan let out a tired chuckle. "You keep asking me that." Mark raised a brow. "And you keep not answering." She looked at him then, really looked at him. This human, this warrior who had risked everything to free her. She had spent so long in a cage that she had almost forgotten what freedom felt like. Now as the stars stretched out before them, endless and open, she realized she wasn't just free. She had someone to fight for that freedom alongside her. The silence in the cockpit felt different now. Not tense, not fearful, just heavy with unspoken thoughts. Susan's fingers trembled slightly as she ran them over the controls, the rush of battle fading, leaving exhaustion in its place. She wasn't sure how long she sat there, staring out at the vast stretch of space beyond the asteroid belt before Mark finally spoke. "We should find somewhere to land," he said. "Check for damage, rest up." Susan nodded absently. "Where?" Mark tapped the console, pulling up a star map. "There's a neutral outpost a few light years from here. It's not the safest place, but it's off the radar. We can lay low. Resupply." Susan hesitated. The idea of stepping foot on a station, even a neutral one, sent a shiver down her spine. Too many people. Too many unknowns. Too many chances for something to go wrong. Mark must have noticed her hesitation. "Look," he said, voice softer now. "You're not in a cage anymore. You don't have to keep running forever. But we can't stay adrift either." She clenched her jaw. He was right, even if she hated the thought of it. "Fine," she muttered. "But I'm staying on the ship." Mark sighed but didn't argue. "I'll handle the supplies, just get some rest." She wanted to protest, but as soon as she leaned back against the seat, her body betrayed her. The exhaustion she had been pushing down since the moment she escaped hit her all at once. Her limbs felt heavy, her eyelids even more so. She barely registered Mark setting a course before sleep pulled her under. She awoke to the distant hum of the ship's engines and the scent of something warm. Susan sat up groggily, her muscles stiff. The cockpit was dim, the light set low. She could see Mark at the small kitchenette in the corner of the ship, stirring something in a tin cup. She blinked. "Are you cooking?" Mark glanced over his shoulder. "Rehydrating," he corrected. "It's just nutrient broth, but it's warm." Susan's stomach twisted and she realized just how long it had been since she had eaten a proper meal. She hesitated, then swung her legs off the seat and stood, wincing as her body protested. Mark noticed but didn't comment. Instead, he handed her the cup. She took it cautiously. The broth was simple, salty, but when she took a sip, warmth spread through her, easing the lingering chill of the cold cell she had been trapped in for so long. Mark sat across from her, arms resting on his knees. "You were out for a while." Susan stared into her cup. "I don't sleep much." "Not surprising," Mark said. "After everything you've been through." She glanced at him. "You say that like you understand." Mark held her gaze for a moment, then sighed. "I do." Susan frowned. "What do you mean?" Mark leaned back slightly. "I used to be a soldier. Fought in the outer wars. Saw things I wish I hadn't. Lost people I shouldn't have." He exhaled slowly. "When the war ended, I thought I'd finally be free of it all. But it doesn't work like that. The things you survive, they don't just leave you. Susan's grip tightened around the cup. She knew that feeling too well. Mark continued, "That's why I do what I do now. Freelance work, helping people who can't fight for themselves." He met her eyes. "People like you." A lump formed in Susan's throat. She wasn't sure if it was anger, gratitude, or something else entirely. "I don't need your pity," she muttered. Mark shook his head. "It's not pity." He gestured around them. "You think I pulled off a rescue like that just because I felt bad for you? No. I did it because you didn't deserve to rot in that place. No one does." Susan stared at him, searching for any sign of deception, but there was none. Just sincerity. She exhaled sharply. "So what now?" Mark shrugged. "That's up to you," she scoffed. "Up to me?" "For the first time in a long time, yeah." Mark gave her a small, knowing smile. "You're free, Susan. You get to decide what comes next." She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him he was wrong, that freedom was just an illusion. But as she sat there sipping the warm broth, feeling the steady hum of the ship beneath her, she realized something. For the first time in years, she didn't know what came next. And maybe, just maybe, that was a good thing. The ship touched, down on the outpost's docking platform with a soft hiss of depressurization. Beyond the reinforced glass of the cockpit, the station loomed, a sprawling structure nestled within the protective rings of a gas giant, its neon lights flickering like distant stars. Susan had spent years trapped in a cold, dark prison. Now, standing at the threshold of the station, she realized just how vast the universe truly was. Mark shut down the engines and unbuckled his harness. "We won't stay long," he assured her. "Just enough to refuel, grab supplies, and figure out our next steps." Susan nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure what next steps meant for her yet. She had spent so long surviving, she had never thought about living. As Mark moved toward the ship's exit, he paused. "You sure you don't want to come with me?" She hesitated. The idea of stepping onto unfamiliar ground, of walking freely among strangers, felt overwhelming, but she also knew she couldn't hide forever. Taking a deep breath, she straightened her shoulders. "I'll try." Mark gave her a small smile, one of encouragement rather than amusement. No rush, one step at a time. The station's air was different, thicker, richer with the scent of metal, fuel, and spices from distant markets. People moved through the corridors, some in heavy combat gear, others in flowing robes, each carrying their own burdens, their own stories. For the first time in a long while, Susan wasn't just an observer behind iron bars. She was part of it. As they entered the trade district, Mark led the way, navigating the maze of vendors and dock workers. Susan stayed close, wary but curious. It was strange, being here without shackles, without a guard dragging her forward. Then, something caught her eye. A small stall nestled between towering cargo crates, its vendor, a wrinkled alien woman with soft golden eyes, displaying delicate trinkets of polished stone and metal. One piece in particular stood out, a simple pendant, its deep blue gem catching the light like a star trapped in glass. Susan ran a finger over the smooth surface. It reminded her of something, of nights spent staring at the stars through the narrow slit of her cell, dreaming of a world beyond her reach. The vendor smiled kindly. "For luck," she said in a raspy voice. Mark stepped forward, already reaching for his credits, but Susan stopped him. "I'll pay for it," she said. Mark raised a brow, but said nothing as she handed over the few credits she had left from a past life. As the pendant settled in her palm, a strange warmth filled her chest. It wasn't much, just a small token, a tiny thing in the grand expanse of the universe. But for her it was a symbol that she was no longer powerless, a symbol that she could make her own choices now. Mark glanced at her, a knowing glint in his eyes. "Guess that means you're sticking around?" Susan smirked. "For now," Mark chuckled, shaking his head. "Well, I can think of worse company." They made their way back to the ship, the hum of the station fading behind them. As they stepped inside, Susan found herself glancing at the pilot's seat, the view of space stretching beyond. Freedom. It was terrifying. It was uncertain. But it was hers. She fastened the pendant around her neck and took a deep breath. "All right, Captain," she said, settling into the co-pilot's chair beside Mark. "Where to next?" Mark grinned as he powered up the engines. "Anywhere we want." As the ship lifted off, breaking through the station's docking bay and soaring into the endless unknown, Susan allowed herself something she had not felt in years: hope.